So, how's everybody doing today?
Good. That's really good.
So today I'm going to be talking about how traditional polling methods in elections have proven to be reliable, but in recent years they have become faulty. I'm going to highlight those faults, and then I'm going to suggest an entirely new way of polling our electorate using some software that Google actually uses. So that's why I decided to call this Mapping a New Way, because even though we're not in uncharted territory in terms of politics, we're still trying to design a new direction that will hopefully be more accurate and more stable. So as I said, in previous years, traditional methods of polling have proven to be quite reliable when trying to predict the outcomes of elections and referendums and measure the outcomes based on what the propositions and people running are. Such as the 2008 U.S. presidential election, 538 projected Obama would win 349 electoral votes, while John McCain would win 189. And then when the actual election happened, Obama won 365 electoral votes, with John McCain winning 173. So the only state that 538 did not get correct was North Carolina, and that was responsible for the 15-point electoral swing in favor of then Senator Obama. But if we wind the clock forward about 8 years, then in the 2016 U.S. presidential election, 538 projected Hillary Clinton to win with a 71.4% chance with 302 electoral votes. And I will also point out that 538 is the polling firm that gave Trump the greatest chance of winning, and as you can see, it was still less than 30%. Not only did Trump win the election, but he won with more electoral votes than Hillary Clinton was projected to win. So they got the percentage wrong, they got the candidate wrong, and they got the number of electoral votes wrong. And this wasn't isolated to just our shores. When you look at the 2016 Brexit referendum, nearly every major poll had Remain with the European Union either slightly in the lead or they had it as a toss-up. But when the referendum results actually happened, nearly 52% of the population voted to leave the European Union, with 48% voting to remain. So they got that one wrong as well. So we have to ask ourselves a couple of questions when we're looking at this. Number one is, why did traditional methods of polling work in 2008, but not 8 years later? Well, one of the biggest reasons is because during that time there was a rise in unconventional candidates and unorthodox ideologies, such as President Trump. He had no previous political experience, he was a reality television star, and he was a businessman. And even though he was on the Republican conservative ticket, he was preaching, so to speak, populist candidate ideas. So there was a new player on the field in politics in general, in the man himself, and in the ideology he was talking about. And then over the course of that 8 years also, the public became extremely polarized in terms of politics. We've all talked about cancel culture, we've all heard that in the news. So people were pushed into corners in such a drastic way that they became terrified to spout their political views in public for fear of repercussions. So they just kept it to themselves. And this created what I call the invisible voter, where they're not telling anyone who they're voting for, who they're supporting, or if they're even going to vote. They just kept it to themselves. They walked into the polling booth, cast their vote, and then they went home and never said a word about it. So even though they weren't showing up in the polls, they still had every intention of voting. So my proposition takes an entirely new prediction path. This would use online traffic data already being taken through internet cookies, and use that to gauge how people are feeling about certain candidates and issues. You would use software known as Google Trends, and you would mark certain words for analysis, such as remain or leave, yes or no, Trump or Biden. And you can search the internet traffic and the amount of searches on the internet based on these words, and you can get an idea of who is becoming more, who the public is becoming more aware of. So let's see if the rubber does well when we put it on the road. So we're going to take a look at Brexit in 2016, as I said before, and we're going to look at traditional polling methods versus what Google Trends can offer. So as I said, when you look at traditional polling data across the last 6 months heading into the referendum, traditional polling had it as Remain was mostly in the lead, or it was a toss-up, with the actual day of the election being cast as 52% would vote to Remain and 48% would vote to leave. However, when you look at Google Trends, leave was always in the lead. So this is the amount of internet searches that is occurring throughout the last month heading into the June referendum, and lead is skyrocketing while remain is remaining relatively small. And I'll also point out that the actual number, 51.81%, is almost identical to what the actual percentage was that the people voted to leave. And this isn't limited to just Brexit either. When you look at different referendums across Europe and the official results versus the Google-based predictions, they are actually very similar. They are either almost identical or they are within the margin of error when predicting the results. So this has a proven track record of being a reliable source. Now you might think, okay, well, if the polls are saying this, then Google Trends must be saying the opposite. Well, no, that's not always the case. There are cases where Google Trends will match with traditional polling methods. So let's take the 2012 U.S. presidential election. The Real Clear Politics average had it about a tie between Obama and Romney. Pew Research gave Obama a slight lead heading into it, and then the official election results was Obama edged Romney out in the election, winning 51, while Romney gained 47. Well, when you look at Google Trends, this is actually pretty identical to what's happening. Both candidates see spikes in their Google searches, and then when we get to the very end of the election, Obama edges Romney out, pretty much identical to what traditional polling methods were saying at the time. So it can happen in both ways, where the polls and Google Trends are together, and then where they vary in opposite directions. But now I will say that there are, of course, flaws with this system. One of the ideas is the awareness of data tracking. Even though the general public right now is not entirely up to speed on what internet cookies and internet traffic can be done to in terms of research and tracking, I believe it will become a problem later on. So as the public realizes what is happening with their internet searches, this could lead to the same dilemma as traditional polling methods, where they're going to be less honest in their Google searches. They're going to be more hesitant to be themselves because they think they're no longer behind actual closed doors. And the system would require updating as the public begins to understand. Another way this could be flawed is this would be a difficult method to use in terms of countries without freedoms of speech and press and less internet access, such as North Korea, Iran, and then countries that manipulate their data before releasing it to the open public, such as China and Russia. So these would be harder countries to try to poll using this method, because if the countries are manipulating their data and their results, well, then you are looking at skewed results according to what that country's agenda might be from their government. And as with any polling method, it cannot predict voter turnout. So you might be seeing some good results for one candidate or another, but it will never tell you who exactly is going to show up in terms of actual election day. And then there are even cases where Google Trends actually gets it wrong and traditional polls get it right. I believe these are rare instances, but one such instance is the 2017 special Senate race between Doug Jones and Roy Moore. Fox News had about a 10-point swing in favor of Jones. And then the actual election results was Moore made up quite a bit of ground, but Jones still edged him out, winning almost 50%. And then when you look at Google Trends, actually Roy Moore had much more internet traffic going on than Doug Jones. Now I will say I would take this with a grain of salt though, because giving all of the accusations and things about Roy Moore, this could be people just Googling what his record was and if he said anything to try to defend himself. So it's not perfect. But overall, I still say this is a better system because it has a proven track record of being a better predictor of election outcomes and results, and it distinguishes true movements from flavor of the month passions. If you see a spike in internet traffic, but then it goes back down, well, that's going to be a flavor of the month. But when you look at something like Google Trends in terms of Brexit, that's a true movement because the data is high and it stays high. And it also reduces that invisible voter factor I talked about. So even though it can't predict voter turnout, you can still see who is truly passionate about their candidates Because if you have more interest and you're searching more candidates on the internet, then there's a greater chance that you will vote. I'm not saying you will vote, but there's a greater chance you will if you're researching candidates, propositions, and different ideologies. So to finish up, I'm going to make my own prediction using my model. So for the upcoming Alabama Senate primary for retiring Senator Richard Shelby's seat, the two main candidates in terms of public awareness and fundraising is Mo Brooks and Katie Britt. And when we look at a poll done in the latter part of last year, released by AL.com, Brooks has about a 5-point lead over Katie Britt with a 4.5% margin of error. So even though they're close, Mo Brooks still has enough lead to where the margin of error shouldn't affect him. But even though this is saying one thing, when you look at Google Trends over the first week of January, it is entirely Katie Britt. And you might think, okay, well that's just a week. You know, maybe she said something, or maybe Mo Brooks did something wrong, you know, and people are just going to Katie Britt to switch ships. Well, when you even look at the past 12 months, it is still Katie Britt. Mo Brooks has a lead going into it because he has congressional experience, he's represented Alabama before, and you know, people know him better. But the more Katie Britt got her name out there, the more she talked about her agenda, the more she became popular, and Mo Brooks dropped off. And one thing I will say is that when you see this right here, all categories, right here, I want you to watch what happens when I put the political filter on. It is entirely Katie Britt. These are political searches that are occurring for names like Katie Britt. But you have to take it with a grain of salt, of course, because, like I said, Katie Britt has no previous political experience, so this could be some people just checking to see who she is. So overall, in conclusion, my prediction is that while traditional polling is showing Mo Brooks with a slight lead, I say that if this trend continues for Katie Britt and if voter turnout is relatively high amongst young people, then Katie Britt will in fact defeat Mo Brooks. So, thank you.
Dakota, if you're correct, do you think that Nate Silver at 538 might hire you?
I have no idea. I would hope so, but I have no idea.
I want to be your secretary if he does.
Okay.
Other questions for our speaker? All right. Thank you so much.
Thank you.